Hey guys! Tonight we journey back to a world where your destiny wasn't a mystery. It was already stamped on your forehead the moment you took your first breath. Welcome to feudal Japan, a land of samurai, peasants, merchants, and priests. A place so bound by hierarchy that even the air seemed to carry the scent of social order. Before you get too comfortable picturing cherry blossoms, poetic moonlight, and stoic warriors posing under waterfalls, let's dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and prepare to meet the brutal reality behind the elegance. And hey, if you enjoy history that pulls no punches, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, let's start from the beginning. The moment you were born in feudal Japan. Not into the world, but into a position, a label, a rank you'd wear for the rest of your life like an invisible tattoo. This wasn't some flexible social ladder where hard work or charm might get you to the top. Nope. This was a staircase sealed with concrete, guarded by centuries of tradition, and reinforced with enough Confucian philosophy to make any attempt at rebellion feel like a moral crime. You were born somewhere on that staircase, and the rest of your life was spent making sure you didn't trip and fall even lower. If you were lucky enough to be born a samurai, congratulations! You'd inherited both privilege and pressure. You'd grow up learning not only how to wield a sword, but how to bow correctly, walk correctly, even breathe correctly. You were the warrior elite, but make no mistake, you were as bound by duty as any farmer was by mud. The Bushido Code, often romanticized today, wasn't all about honor and poetry. It was about obedience, endurance, and sacrifice. You didn't live for yourself. You lived for your lord, your clan, and the unspoken rules that hovered like ghosts over your every move. But most people weren't samurai. In fact, the majority of Japan's population were peasants, farmers who toiled endlessly under the unforgiving sun. Rice was life, and for these people, it wasn't just food. It was their currency, their tax, their identity. Imagine working all year, sweating over every grain, only to hand most of it over to your local daimyo so he could maintain his military and keep the social machine turning. You could say peasants carried the entire country on their backs, quite literally, and yet their position remained one of the lowest. You worked the land, but you didn't own it. The land owned you. Now, if you thought merchants might have had it better, think again. In a twist of irony, the people dealing with money were considered morally inferior. Merchants didn't produce anything tangible, so in the eyes of Confucian ethics, they were parasites feeding off others' labor. Never mind that they were often richer than samurai. A merchant could buy silk and wine, but never status. You might have the wealth of 10 lords, but your name still whispered through society's gutters. So what do you do when you're rich but despised? You buy your dignity in subtle ways, funding temples, donating to shrines, marrying your children upward into fallen samurai families desperate for cash. It wasn't exactly social mobility, it was social camouflage. Then there were the artisans, the craftsmen, blacksmiths, potters, and weavers, who filled to Pan's towns with skill and precision. They sat above merchants, but below peasants, which made about as much sense as ranking a sushi chef below a rice farmer just because the rice came first. But the logic wasn't economic, it was philosophical. Creation was valued, profit was not. You could make a perfect katana or a tibu that would one day sit in a shogun's chamber, but you'd still bow to the farmer who grew your food. And below all of this, beneath even the merchants, lurked the outcasts, the Eta and Hinin, the untouchables. These were the people who did society's dirty work: butchers, leather workers, grave diggers, executioners. You could think of them as the invisible scaffolding of feudal Japan. Everyone depended on them, but no one wanted to acknowledge them. They handled the blood, the bodies, the death that everyone else pretended didn't exist. Children were taught not to even touch their shadows. Imagine growing up knowing that your very presence was considered pollution, that even rain washing off your hands might be seen as impure. This was the world you entered at birth. A world that didn't ask who you wanted to be, only who you were allowed to be. And the rules weren't just social. They weren't spiritual, legal, and existential. Step out of your place, and you weren't just disobedient. You were unnatural. The system wasn't designed to be questioned, because it was supposedly the natural order of the universe. But, of course, humans have never been great at staying perfectly still. Beneath the layers of obedience, resentment simmered. Ambition whispered in the night. And as the centuries rolled on, cracks began to form in Japan's flawless facade of order. Some people found clever ways to bend the rules without breaking them. Some defied them outright, because even in a world carved into rigid classes, the human spirit has a habit of slipping through the cracks, quietly, rebelliously, beautifully. And that's where we'll go next, into the daily grind of each class, from the samurai's code to the peasant's toil, to see how people not only survived, but sometimes thrived under the crushing weight of destiny. So, let's lace up those straw sandals and walk straight into the life of a samurai. Forget everything the movies taught you about quiet meditation and poetic sword duels under the cherry blossoms. Real samurai life wasn't a daily haiku. It was a full-time job with impossible expectations, social pressure, and the constant looming possibility that one mistake, one word, one look, one drop of disrespect could end with you slicing open your own stomach to preserve your honor. Welcome to your first day on duty. You were born into the warrior class, but don't let that title fool you. You didn't spend your days charging into battle like an action hero. Most samurai lived during long stretches of peace, especially under the Tokugawa shogunate. And peace, for a warrior, was its own kind of torture. With no wars to fight, samurai became bureaucrats, teachers, police, or even glorified accountants. You might have carried 2 swords, but your most dangerous weapon was your calligraphy brush. Imagine training for years to become a master swordsman, only to spend your life managing rice taxes and writing reports for your daimyo, who hadn't left his castle in a decade. But, of course, even in peace, appearances mattered. You couldn't just stop being a samurai. The code of Bushido was more than a rule book. It was your entire identity. Honor, loyalty, discipline. You lived under these words like they were carved into your bones. You bowed deeply, spoke humbly, and moved with quiet precision. Your haircut, your clothing, even your sword maintenance reflected your worth. A dull blade was a dull soul. A wrinkled kimono was a stain on your reputation. Every act, no matter how small, was a reflection of your inner virtue. And if your lord ordered you to do something that conflicted with your personal beliefs, too bad. Bushido didn't ask for your opinion. It demanded your obedience. Still, beneath all that stoic discipline, there were cracks. Some samurai were broke, living off stipends that barely covered their food. Others grew bitter, resenting their lords, or the new, unspoken truth that money was starting to matter more than honor. By the 18th century, merchants were quietly gaining influence, and many samurai hated it. Imagine watching the people you were taught to despise build bigger houses and dress in finer silk, while you, the noble warrior, had to sell your sword just to buy dinner. Pride clashed with poverty, and many samurai found themselves trapped between old ideals and new realities. Then there was the ritual of seppuku, the infamous act of slicing your abdomen open to restore your honor. It sounds horrifying because it was, but for the samurai it was considered the ultimate proof of sincerity. You didn't just say sorry, you demonstrated it with blood. Witnesses were required. The ceremony was deliberate, calm, almost beautiful in its horror. It's hard for modern minds to grasp how normalized it was, how dying with dignity was valued more than living with disgrace. But that's the thing about Bushido. It wasn't about survival. It was about purity of spirit. And purity, in this world, often came with a price tag written in pain. When a samurai wasn't caught between duty and death, he was expected to embody refinement. Swordsmanship and poetry went in hand. You could behead a man in the morning and write a verse about plum blossoms in the afternoon. That contradiction wasn't hypocrisy. It was balance. To wield death and beauty with equal grace was the mark of a true warrior. The tea ceremony, for instance, wasn't some dainty pastime. It was a meditation on control, patience, and respect. Every gesture in that quiet ritual echoed the same discipline demanded on the battlefield. But let's not romanticize too much. Samurai weren't flawless paragons of wisdom and restraint. Some were drunkards. Some were bullies. Some used their status to exploit others. Just because you were born noble didn't mean you behaved nobly. And when the rigid class lines started to erode, many samurai found themselves lost, their purpose evaporating. What do you do when your entire identity, your reason for existing, is tied to a system that no longer needs you? That's where the concept of jiri and ninjo, the tug-of-war between duty and emotion, came to define their inner struggle. Giri was obligation to your lord, your family, your code. Ninjo was human feeling, love, compassion, personal desire. The two were always at odds. You might fall in love with someone beneath your class, but your duty forbade it. You might disagree with your lord's command, but your honor required obedience. Living as a samurai meant constantly choosing principle over passion. And yet, beneath that armor, every samurai was still human. They laughed, they feared, they questioned, quietly, secretly. As the shogunate stabilized the country, war became memory, and swords became symbols. A samurai's life turned from combat to ceremony. Your blade was no longer for battle, but for identity, a polished relic of a fading era. But while the samurai's glory began to rust, the world outside their castles didn't stop turning. Farmers still toiled, merchants still hustled, artisans still crafted, and the lowest classes still carried the burdens nobody else wanted to touch. And in the villages below those high castle walls, the real Japan, the one that kept the nation alive, was sweating, starving, and dreaming of rice. The smell of wet earth and sweat hits you before the sunrise does. Roosters crow, crickets fade, and you, born a peasant, are already awake, already working. Welcome to the backbone of feudal Japan, the world of the common farmer. Forget honor codes and silk robes. Your life revolves around a single crop, rice. Not just food, not just trade. Rice was the heartbeat of the entire country. It determined taxes, wealth, and even power. The samurai might have held the swords, but you held the fields. Without your labor, the empire's hierarchy would crumble like cracked pottery. But don't get too proud, because in this world, gratitude never reached your doorstep. You didn't own the land you worked. The daimyo did, and the daimyo answered to the shogun. Your job was to grow rice for them, pay your taxes in rice, and somehow feed your family with what little was left. Taxes could swallow up 40, sometimes even 60% of your harvest. Imagine spending every waking hour breaking your back under the sun just to hand most of it away. Your new hunger intimately. Your ribs might show while your lord's dogs feasted on leftovers. And complaining? That was suicide, figuratively and sometimes literally. Speaking against authority wasn't defiance, it was rebellion. And rebellion didn't end with a fine, it ended with a sword. Life in the village followed the rhythm of the seasons. Planting, tending, harvesting, repeating. The year wasn't measured in months, but in labor cycles. You rose before dawn, your feet sinking into the flooded paddies, leeches wriggling around your ankles, the smell of manure heavy in the air. Every movement was a prayer for good weather. Drought could mean starvation. A bad flood could erase a year's work overnight. And yet, despite the misery, you found moments of peace. The chirping frogs at night, the laughter around a shared pot of soup, the simple joy of watching a child chase fireflies through the dark. Because even when life was harsh, it was still life, and peasants knew how to find meaning in survival. Religion seeped into every corner of daily routine. You prayed to the local kami, the spirits of the land, begging them to bless your fields. Shrines weren't just for worship, they were the village's heart, the center of festivals, gatherings, and hope. Shinto rituals mixed with Buddhist beliefs in a way that didn't always make sense, but somehow worked. You'd offer rice to the gods and then turn around and eat the same rice yourself because, well, you couldn't afford not to. Faith and practicality walked hand in hand, bound by necessity. And yet, while peasants were considered low in status, they held one crucial privilege. They produced food. That made them, in theory, more useful than merchants or artisans. Confucian philosophy placed them above those who profited from trade. Of course, that honor didn't mean comfort. It just meant your suffering was considered morally superior. You didn't get to choose your role, but at least you could claim virtue while starving. Lucky you. Still, peasants weren't powerless. In tight-knit villages, community meant everything. Families helped each other plant and harvest. When one fell sick, others picked up the slack. Social order was strict, but within those boundaries there was unity. People gossiped, laughed, arranged marriages, and celebrated festivals that brought color to an otherwise gray existence. Bon Odori dances, New Year prayers, harvest feasts, these moments reminded everyone they were still human, still connected by something larger than rank. But not all peasants accepted their fate quietly. Sometimes desperation turned into rebellion. History remembers the peasant uprisings, the quirky, where villages banded together to protest taxes or corruption. Armed with farm tools and pure rage, they'd march against their local lords. And though these revolts were often crushed, they carried an unmistakable message. Even in a world built on submission, people could still bite back. Those moments, rare as they were, showed that human dignity was stubborn. It refused to vanish entirely, no matter how heavy the chains of class became. Daily life was built on endurance. A peasant's home was a small wooden hut with a thatched roof and a dirt floor. Smoke from the cooking fire blackened the ceiling, while rain crept through the walls in winter. Meals were simple, mostly rice, barley, and whatever vegetables could survive the season. Meat, rare. Fish, a luxury. Salted pickles and fermented soy paste were your flavor palette. You'd eat in silence because words couldn't fill stomachs. And yet you'd share what little you had with neighbors, because starvation was less cruel when faced together. Education was another wall. Reading and writing were luxuries reserved for samurai or monks. But peasants weren't ignorant. They passed knowledge through experience. They knew when to plant by the smell of the air, when to brace for rain by the shift in the wind, when to fear illness by the way the cicadas screamed. It was an intelligence rooted in instinct, not ink. Still, poverty was relentless. If your crop failed, you borrowed rice from wealthier villagers or local money lenders, sinking into debt that could haunt generations. You could lose your land, your freedom, your dignity. Famines swept through villages like wildfires, and yet people adapted, inventing ways to survive, mixing tree bark into gruel, boiling grass, even eating dirt for minerals. It wasn't resilience by choice, it was survival by force. Yet, even in this world of mud and misery, beauty persisted. Lanterns glowing in the night, children laughing barefoot through puddles, the scent of rain-soaked soil after harvest, moments of quiet defiance against despair. You might not have had freedom or wealth, but you had endurance, and endurance was its own kind of rebellion. Still, for every peasant who toiled in silence, there was a merchant in town counting coins and making deals, quietly undermining the hierarchy that kept the farmers kneeling. The muddy scent of the fields fades, replaced by the sharp tang of fish, smoke, and ink. You're no longer standing ankle deep in rice water. Now you're shoulder to shoulder in the busy streets of Edo. The air hums with chatter, laughter, the clack of wooden sandals on packed dirt. Merchants line the narrow roads, their stalls overflowing with silks, spices, and every imaginable trinket. Welcome to the merchant's world, loud, colorful, and quietly rebellious. Here, profit was power, even if society pretended otherwise. By Confucian standards, merchants ranked second to last on Japan's social ladder, just above the outcasts. The samurai ruled, peasants fed the nation, artisans created its beauty, and you, the merchant, were considered morally suspect. Why? Because you didn't make anything. You just moved goods from one place to another and somehow got richer doing it. To the traditional elite, that smelled of greed. But to you, it smelled like opportunity. While samurai clung to ideals of honor and discipline, merchants dealt in the one thing that actually made the world spin: money. Rice might have been the official currency, but gold, silver, and copper flowed through your hands. You understood the system better than the people running it. And as long as the shogunate needed supplies, you had leverage. You might not have had rank, but you had influence. And influence, when handled quietly, could buy more than any sword. Picture yourself in Edun, around the mid-1700s. The city is booming, the population swelling to over 1 million people, one of the largest cities in the world. The economy hums with energy, and you, the merchant, stand in the center of it all. You wear your humility like armor. Simple robes, plain houses, nothing too flashy in public. But behind closed doors, gold screens, porcelain tea sets, lacquered chests bursting with silver. The hypocrisy was the point. You had to appear modest while living lavishly in secret, because in a world obsessed with hierarchy, your greatest skill was pretending to know your place while subtly climbing above it. Samurai might sneer at you in public, but privately, many of them needed you. Their stipends, paid in rice, lost value as market prices shifted. Soldiers sold their rice to you for prash. You, in turn, sold it to others for profit. Slowly, the balance of power began to shift. The warrior elite started borrowing money from the very people they despised. And you lent it to them, with interest, of course. It was a quiet revolution, one coin at a time. Merchants weren't just traders. They were the arteries of urban Japan. You arranged transportation, managed warehouses, tracked prices, and navigated the complex web of taxes and guilds. You learned how to read and write, how to calculate, how to flatter and deceive when necessary. You could spot opportunity faster than a samurai could draw a blade. The city depended on your networks. Without merchants, no rice reached the capital, no silk left the countryside, no paper found its way to the calligraphy schools. You might not have worn a sword, but you controlled what those swordsmen ate, drank, and wore. Still, your success came with a constant sense of danger. The government enforced sumptuary laws, restrictions on luxury. Merchants were forbidden from wearing fine silk, owning lavish homes, or flaunting wealth. You could be fined or publicly humiliated for being too successful. So you learned the art of subtlety. You'd line the inside of your robes with expensive silk no one could see. Your home looked plain from the street, but opened into a maze of exquisite rooms hidden behind sliding doors. Every merchant's life was a double performance: humility on the surface, brilliance beneath. Despite your wealth, you still couldn't climb socially. No title, no samurai name, no hereditary privilege. So you aimed for the next best thing: marriage alliances. You'd marry your daughter to a samurai from a struggling family, effectively buying status for the next generation. These alliances blurred the lines of class. The warrior might bring honor, but you brought survival, a perfect trade. Over time, these subtle exchanges began to reshape society. The samurai's pride was priceless, but their rice was not. Culturally, the merchant class birthed something extraordinary: the Chonin culture, the vibrant world of townspeople that gave rise to kabuki theater, ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and pleasure districts like Yoshiwara. While the upper classes meditated on virtue and restraint, you and your fellow townsfolk celebrated life's fleeting joys. The floating world, as it was called, was your creation, a place where beauty, entertainment, and indulgence existed outside rigid morality. You sponsored artists, actors, courtesans, and poets, people who thrived on imagination and desire rather than duty. The shogunate may have controlled politics, but you controlled taste. And oh, the irony! The same samurai who lectured about discipline spent their nights under the lantern glow of Yoshiwara, emptying their purses in pursuit of pleasure you financed. You gave them silk for their robes, sake for their tables, and illusions to escape the boredom of peace. You fed their hypocrisy, and they paid you handsomely for it. The merchant's revenge wasn't rebellion, it was patience. Let the samurai cling to their honor, you'd quietly buy the ground beneath their feet. Still, life in the city wasn't just glamour and profit. Fires ripped through wooden neighborhoods regularly, wiping out entire districts in hours. Epidemics came and went, and always the government's suspicion lingered over you. One wrong word, one flaunt luxury, and your shop could be shut down. So you balanced success with silence, wealth with discretion. You lived in constant negotiation, not just of prices, but of survival. Yet in the end, the merchant class became the silent architect of a new Japan, You proved that influence didn't need permission, that power could wear the mask of humility. While others bowed to status, you bowed to opportunity. You didn't need to fight wars or plow fields to shape history. You just needed to understand how people's needs could become your profit. But beneath this rising tide of commerce, there were still those whom society refused to even see, the artisans who made Japan's beauty possible, but were treated as tools, not people. Next, we'll step into their workshops, where sparks flew from forges and brushes danced on silk, to uncover how creativity survived under the shadow of hierarchy. The clang of a hammer replaces the chatter of the market. The air smells of smoke, metal, and freshly cut wood. You've stepped into the dim workshop of an artisan, where beauty is born through sweat and precision. Here, every object, the gleam of a sword's edge, the curve of a ceramic bowl, the brushstroke of a scroll, is a quiet act of rebellion against monotony. You are no samurai, no peasant, no merchant. You are something in between, the maker, the hands behind Japan's perfection. Artisans in feudal Japan were officially ranked below peasants but above merchants. In theory, that meant your work was respected. After all, you created tangible things. But in practice, you lived in the same fragile balance as everyone else, caught between reverence and invisibility. Samurai might praise the craftsmanship of your katana, but they'd never shake your hand. Merchants would profit off your creations while pretending you were beneath them, and peasants, they envied your city life but pitied your lack of land. You existed in a strange limbo, indispensable yet undervalued. Your craft defined your life from birth. If your father was a potter, you'd be a potter. If he forged swords, you'd grow up beside the anvil. Skills were inherited like bloodlines, guarded as fiercely as family honor. Apprenticeships lasted years, sometimes decades. You'd begin as an errand runner, fetching water, chopping firewood, watching in silence while your master worked. Only after endless repetition and scolding would you be allowed to touch the tools. And even then, your first attempts would probably end up shattered or crooked. But that was the point. Perfection wasn't the goal, it was the journey. In Kyoto, artisans crafted kimonos so intricate that one garment could take months. In Edo, carpenters built wooden bridges without nails, using nothing but complex joinery passed down through generations. Swordsmiths folded steel hundreds of times to create blades sharp enough to slice through armor, yet flexible enough not to break. Every strike of the hammer carried centuries of knowledge. Every brushstroke echoed a lineage of unseen hands. The process was ritual, not just work. The Japanese concept of shokunin, the master craftsman, wasn't about fame or wealth. It was about devotion. The pride wasn't in being known. It was in knowing you'd created something that would outlive you. Still, devotion didn't pay taxes. Artisans depended on merchants to sell their goods, and merchants took their cut, often the lion's share. You might spend weeks carving a lacquer box only to receive enough money to barely buy rice for your family. And since artisans lived in towns, food prices were high, space was cramped, and social mobility was non-existent. Your entire worth rested on your hands. A sickness, an injury, even a tremor in your fingers could destroy your livelihood overnight. There was no safety net, only pride and persistence. Yet there was dignity in mastery. The discipline of creation offered something spiritual, almost sacred. While samurai practiced bushido, artisans lived by an unspoken code of craftsmanship. Patience, humility, precision. Your world revolved around balance, between strength and delicacy, tradition and innovation. A single mistake could ruin a week's work, but perfection required wrist. That tension was the heartbeat of every workshop. Some artisans achieved fame despite the odds. Potters like Tojito, the creator of rakuware, turned imperfections into art, celebrating roughness and asymmetry as beauty itself. This philosophy, wabi-sabi, embraced the transient and imperfect nature of life. A chipped tea bowl wasn't a flaw, it was a story. Every crack, every glaze bubble was proof of the human touch. In a world obsessed with order and rank, artisans were quietly teaching the nation that imperfection could be beautiful, that humanity could shine through the rigid lines of class. But artistry wasn't always peaceful. Swordsmiths worked under immense pressure. A samurai's honor depended on the weapon you forged. If your blade failed in battle, your reputation shattered with it. And because swordsmiths worked with dangerous heat and fumes, many died young. Calligraphers went blind from candlelight. Lacquer workers inhaled toxic resin. Beauty had a body count, though few ever spoke of it. The nation admired the results, not the sacrifices behind them. The communal spirit among artisans mirrored that of peasants. Workshops were families, apprentices like adopted sons. You shared food, laughter, and exhaustion. Festivals brought temporary joy, days when work paused and lanterns lit the narrow streets. You'd drink sake, sing old songs, and for one night forget that you were bound by caste. In those moments, it didn't matter that a samurai might pass you tomorrow without a glance. You had pride, and pride was its own form of freedom.
Still, the artisan's life wasn't free from hypocrisy. The same society that demanded your creations restricted your expression. Innovation was dangerous. Deviation from tradition was frowned upon. The shogunate preferred consistency over creativity. It made control easier. But art has a way of slipping through cracks. Quietly,
Artisans began experimenting. New glazes, new patterns, new methods. The floating world of merchants and courtesans hungered for novelty, and you provided it. Pleasure districts demanded color, texture, beauty, and you, forbidden from power, became the supplier of joy. Through your hands, Japan's culture evolved. Ukiyo-e artists carved the faces of kabuki stars and famous courtesans, spreading them across the nation like early celebrity posters. Craftsmen built the tea houses where samurai and poets met. The world of the artisan became the world of the people, the soul beneath the armor of hierarchy. But not everyone had the privilege of creation. Beyond your workshop, outside the city walls, lived those stripped of all dignity. The outcasts forced to handle death, blood, and impurity. The air thickens as we move beyond the bright city streets, past the hum of marketplaces and temple bells, into the edges of society, the place most people pretended didn't exist. The scent of smoke fades, replaced by something heavier: rot, leather, iron, and blood. Here, in the shadow of Japan's rigid order, live the barakumen, the outcasts of feudal Japan. They were the invisible hands that made the pure world possible. And their story? It's the one the history books tried hardest to erase. You wouldn't even call them peasants. The term eta meant abundant filth, a label that said everything about how society viewed them. They were the slaughterers, the tanners, the butchers, the undertakers, the ones who touched death so that others didn't have to. Buddhism preached purity, and touching blood or corpses was defilement. But someone had to do the dirty work. Someone had to tan leather for armor, dispose of animal carcasses, clean up after executions. And that someone was you, born into a name that meant unclean. In the eyes of the law, eta and hinnin, another group of outcasts, beggars, entertainers, criminals, weren't even people. They couldn't own land. They couldn't enter temples. They couldn't marry outside their caste. If their shadow touched a well, villagers would refuse to drink from it. If they walked through a marketplace, people spat. Their homes sat on the outskirts, cramped, muddy, cut off by invisible borders. Everyone obeyed without question. You were born knowing the limits of your existence. No matter how skilled or kind you were, purity was out of reach. You could scrub your hands raw, but society still saw the stain. Samurai believed your very presence tainted their honor. Monks turned their eyes away. Even peasants, who had little more than the dirt they farmed, felt superior. The hierarchy was cruelly efficient. It gave everyone someone else to look down on. Yet, within this cursed world, life persisted. Aetha communities built their own rhythms, tight-knit, resilient, even joyful at times. You learned to laugh, to celebrate, to marry, even when the rest of Japan pretended you didn't exist. Children played beside tanneries. Women wove straw sandals and mended clothes. Men worked with leather and bone, turning what others called impurity into craft. The work was harsh, the stench constant, but it was work, and work meant survival. The Kinin, meanwhile, lived a transient life. Some were beggars, others entertainers, some criminals serving sentences of social exile. They wandered between towns, performing dances, reciting tales, juggling for coins. Ironically, their impurity gave them a strange freedom. While everyone else was locked into duty, they floated outside the rules, observing the absurdity of the system from the margins. You could say they were Japan's first counterculture, mocked, pitied, but also quietly envied. Of course, not all freedom was chosen. Punishment in feudal Japan often meant being stripped of status and sent into the ranks of the Hinan. A samurai who broke his oath, a merchant who cheated taxes, a thief caught stealing, any of them could find themselves branded impure overnight. It was the ultimate social death. Once you fell into that pit, there was no climbing out. Not even suicide could restore your honor. You die unclean, your soul excluded from salvation. But the irony of purity was everywhere. The samurai's pristine armor, made of leather tanned by Ita hands, the elegant paper lamps in a noble's home, glued with animal fat, the grand funerals of the wealthy, prepared by those forbidden to enter temples. The very society that condemned you depended on your labor. You were indispensable, yet untouchable. Some outcasts found subtle ways to fight back. They became masters of their trades, producing leatherwork or musical instruments so fine that nobles would buy them, but through intermediaries, of course. You'd never meet your own clients, never hear their praise, yet your work would live in their homes, unacknowledged but essential. A quiet revenge carved in leather and wood. Others resisted through culture. The Kawada communities, a subgroup of Ita, developed their own festivals, songs, and folklore. Stories where impurity became strength, where gods favored the rejected. One legend tells of an Issa butcher who saved a starving village by slaughtering a sacred cow, an act considered blasphemy. When the villagers shunned him, the gods rewarded him instead, declaring that true sin wasn't in blood, but in hypocrisy. It was a dangerous story, but it survived in whispers. And then came the unthinkable moments, when the boundaries cracked. Famines, wars, disasters, times when survival blurred the lines of purity. During the great famines of the 18th century, samurai and peasants alike turned to outcast settlements for help. When bodies filled the streets, Edda buried them. When meat was scarce, butchers became lifesavers. For brief, flickering moments, you were necessary. Not hated, not feared, just human. But once peace returned, so did the hierarchy. The shogunate reinforced caste lines even harder, punishing Etta who dared to wear silk or build nicer homes. They feared contamination of both blood and order. Society's stability relied on people believing they belonged exactly where they were born. Still, beneath the surface, change was coming. The slow decay of the old order had begun. The world was moving toward something new. Cities growing, merchants rising, foreigners whispering at the borders. And for those trapped at the bottom, the promise of cracks in the system felt like hope. If the Etta lived in the shadows, then the Chonin, the merchants and artisans, lived in the glow of lanterns and coin. You could smell their world before you saw it. The scent of sake, freshly printed paper, and lacquered wood mingling with the faint tang of ambition. Their towns, Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, were alive, pulsing like veins in the body of the shogunate. Streets crammed with vendors calling out prices, women in bright kimonos gliding between stalls, and somewhere a samisen twanging through the night. On paper, the Chonin stood near the bottom of the hierarchy, but in reality, they were quietly becoming its heartbeat. Feudal Japan's social pyramid claimed that samurai ruled by virtue, peasants by labor, artisans by skill, and merchants, well, by greed. The merchants were ranked dead last because they produced nothing. They merely bought and sold what others made. But gold has a funny way of rewriting moral philosophy. As the Tokugawa peace dragged on, samurai wages stayed fixed in rice stipends while merchants handled actual money. And money, sweet, tangible, glittering money, started bending the system in ways the old codes could never predict. Imagine a samurai walking into your shop. His swords gleam, his posture screams dignity. But you know something he doesn't want anyone else to know. He's broke. His rice stipend doesn't stretch like it used to. He has debts. And you, lowly, common, impure merchant that you are, can save him. You offer him credit, perhaps a fine kimono on loan, a few coins to tide him over. He swallows his pride, nods curtly, and takes the deal. You both understand what just happened. The invisible balance of power shifted. This was the quiet revolution of the Chonin, influence through debt. The merchant couldn't wield a sword, but he could own the scabbard. He couldn't issue an order, but he could decide whose name was written in his ledger. And in a society where appearance was everything, samurai borrowed not just money, but image. From the merchant's wealth, taste, and connections. It was the kind of humiliation they'd never admit aloud, but one they lived every day. Yet, the Chonin didn't just drive through trade. They built culture, literally. Theaters, brothels, tea houses, and bookshops all flourished because of them. Edo's floating world, the ukiyo, existed for their pleasure and their coin. They patronized kabuki actors, bought woodblock prints, and collected the latest gossip the way samurai collected swords. They were the tastemakers of their time, creating a new urban aesthetic, one dripping with indulgence, color, and irony. And oh, the irony was thick. The samurai preached frugality, loyalty, and moral purity, yet spent their nights getting drunk in the very pleasure districts the Chonin funded. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige immortalized this contradiction in their woodblock prints. Lush worlds of courtesans, dancers, and fireworks, all financed by people technically beneath the samurai. But being a Chonin wasn't just about excess. It was also about fear. The shogunate watched their rise with growing suspicion. Laws called sumptuary regulations dictated what you could wear, eat, or even build. Silk for samurai, cotton for commoners. Two-story houses, forbidden. Lavish feasts, banned. It didn't stop anyone. Merchants found loopholes, wearing plain kimono outside, but lining them with the most expensive silk inside. Their rebellion wasn't loud. It was elegant, hidden in seams and patterns no official could see. In Osaka, the city of merchants, fortunes were made overnight. Rice brokers turned grain into gold, controlling prices and influencing entire provinces. When a bad harvest hit, they became kingmakers. The phrase, Tenka no Daidokoro, the kitchen of the realm, wasn't just poetic. Osaka fed Japan, and those who controlled its warehouses quietly fed its power structure too. Still, despite their growing wealth, Chonin lived under constant social pressure. No matter how successful you were, your children couldn't become samurai. Your name could never enter noble registers. You could buy influence, but not legitimacy. And for a culture obsessed with lineage, that was a wound money couldn't heal. So merchants found another way to leave a legacy: art. They built schools, sponsored poets, and commissioned paintings. Their names might not be written in the samurai chronicles, but they were etched in ukiyo-e prints, whispered through haiku, and remembered in kabuki plays. And beneath all the commerce and glamour, the Chonin's world had its own rhythm, a relentless grind that modern life would find eerily familiar. Long work days in cramped shops, apprentices sleeping under counters, rising before dawn to sweep streets and prepare ink. Young women working in textile houses till their fingers bled, all for a few copper coins. Success wasn't luck. It was exhaustion with style. Yet the merchant's story wasn't one of pure greed. It was survival dressed as prosperity. They knew the fragility of favor. One wrong deal, one political scandal, one famine, and everything could vanish. The same officials who borrowed from them could destroy them overnight with a stroke of a brush. They lived between fear and fortune, never certain which side of the blade they'd fall on. And still they smiled. They learned to play the long game. Their children learned reading, arithmetic, even calligraphy, skills samurai sneered at as beneath them. But when Japan finally opened its gates to the world centuries later, those same skills would make the merchant's descendants the first modern businessmen, the first bankers, the first true capitalists of Japan. But that's jumping ahead. For now, the Jonin's lanterns still burn bright, casting their glow over an increasingly restless world. Beyond those lights, the samurai's grip is weakening, though they don't yet see it. And as the economy shifts, so too does something deeper, the spirit of Japan itself. The clang of steel on steel was once the heartbeat of Japan. For centuries, the samurai lived and died by the sword, loyal, disciplined, bound to their lords through oaths of blood and duty. But by the Edo period, that rhythm had dulled into something quieter, something almost tragic. The wars were over. The shogunate had unified the land. Peace had arrived, and peace, ironically, was the beginning of the samurai's slow decay. Imagine waking every morning knowing your life's purpose. Fighting was now forbidden. The sword you were trained to wield, the code you were sworn to uphold, the honor you die to defend, all reduced to a symbol. You were still feared, still respected, still the elite of the nation, but you no longer had a war to fight. You were a warrior without a battlefield, a tiger locked in a cage made of etiquette and paper. In theory, you served your daimyo, your feudal lord. You studied strategy, politics, Confucian texts. You were supposed to embody virtue, but in practice, you were a bureaucrat in armor, a glorified accountant. Many samurai spent their days writing reports, managing taxes, or policing peasants who didn't bow low enough. Others stood guard at gates for hours on end, performing rituals of discipline so hollow they bordered on parody. Your stipend came in rice, fixed, traditional, and increasingly worthless as inflation crept in. Meanwhile, the merchants, those lowly tradesmen, dealt in coin, and coin was freedom. You began to borrow, just a little at first, maybe for a new kimono to maintain appearances, maybe to pay off gambling debts, maybe because your lord's taxes left you hungry. Whatever the reason, you found yourself visiting a merchant's shop not as a noble patron, but as a desperate debtor. And every time you bowed to ask for credit, a little piece of your pride stayed behind on that tatami floor. Some samurai couldn't bear it. They sold their swords, their souls, really, to survive. Others pawned family heirlooms, became tutors, or even ronin, masterless samurai wandering from town to town, scraping by as bodyguards or hired thugs. You could spot them easily, the worn hakama, the hungry eyes, the swagger covering quiet despair. They were ghosts of a once mighty class, drifting between honor and hunger. But let's be clear, the samurai didn't vanish quietly. Their code, Bushido, became both shield and prison. It demanded absolute loyalty, purity, self-sacrifice. The idea of dying with honor was more appealing than living in disgrace. And so, when faced with shame, failure, debt, insult, many turned to the only escape their code allowed: seppuku, ritual suicide. You might think it's barbaric, but to them it was transcendence. Better to die cleanly than live dishonored. The body may bleed, but the name remains pure. Yet, as romantic as that sounds, the reality was far grimmer. By the late Edo period, hundreds of samurai committed seppuku not for glory, but for debt, frustration, or political helplessness. Some even did it as protest against corruption, against their lords, against a system that trapped them in empty honor. Death became the last way to make a statement in a world that no longer listened. Still, not all succumbed to despair. Many adapted. Some became scholars, poets, and philosophers. Deprived of war, they turned their minds inward. The art of the sword became the art of the brush. Martial discipline evolved into spiritual refinement. The samurai class produced thinkers who debated morality, governance, and even economics, ironically embracing the very skills they once despised. One of the most fascinating ironies of the age was the rise of the Bushido myth itself. The code, in its strict form, was never really a unified doctrine. It was a patchwork of ideals, myths, and after-the-fact justifications. But as the samurai grew weaker, writers and officials romanticized their past, turning them into moral icons. The same class that was falling apart in reality was being resurrected in literature as paragons of virtue. It was like building statues to heroes who were still alive but already broken. In Edo's bustling streets, you could see them. Proud samurai walking among commoners who secretly pitied them. Children imitated them with wooden swords, while merchants whispered about their debts. The once terrifying warrior was now part of the city's scenery, a relic dressed in silk instead of armor. And yet, even in decline, the samurai held Japan together. Their belief in hierarchy, order, and discipline kept the peace. Their devotion to duty maintained structure. It was as if the ghost of their old power still haunted the land, whispering stability into a system that should have collapsed long ago. But beneath that calm exterior, the cracks deepened. Ronin multiplied. Small uprisings flared in rural provinces. Discontent simmered, not just among peasants, but within the warrior class itself. They could sense something shifting, though they didn't yet know what. The arrival of Western ships on Japan's shores would soon shatter centuries of isolation, and with it, the very identity of the samurai. For now, though, the warrior still walks at dusk, sword gleaming in the dying light, unaware that the sun setting on the horizon isn't just the end of a day, it's the twilight of an entire era. While the samurai paced courtyards dreaming of wars that would never come, the noble class, the aristocrats of Kyoto's imperial court, lived in a world so detached from reality it could have been another planet. Imagine spending your life surrounded by gold screens, incense smoke, and poetry contests, while the rest of the country sweated under the sun. That was the Kyujei class, descendants of ancient nobility who once ruled Japan, now reduced to ceremonial ghosts. Centuries earlier, they'd been the heartbeat of power, the ones who whispered policy into emperors' ears, composed laws, and decided fates with a brushstroke. But by the Edo period, they had been sidelined by the shogunate. The Tokugawa ruled the country, while the emperor and his court were confined to Kyoto, beautiful, revered, but politically irrelevant. The Kyujei still performed rituals, still held ranks with names that sounded impressive, but their influence was mostly ornamental. Their days followed rhythms of elegance, mornings filled with tea ceremonies, afternoons with poetry or calligraphy, evenings with soft music and philosophical chatter. You might think it sounds idyllic, and it was if you had the fortune to be born there. But it was also suffocating. Every bow, every phrase, every gesture was dictated by protocol. There was no spontaneity, no freedom, only layers upon layers of refinement. You could spend an hour debating which shade of purple best represented the scent of plum blossoms. That was your politics. Money was scarce. The imperial court was poor, relying on stipends from the shogunate, stipends that barely covered the cost of their rituals. Some nobles sold family heirlooms. Others secretly borrowed from merchants. A few even married into wealthy chonin families under the table to stay afloat. That's right. The descendants of Japan's divine rulers quietly depending on the same merchants their ancestors once scorned. It was hypocrisy with a silken smile. Still, the Kyujei found ways to preserve dignity. Their real power wasn't in politics, it was in culture. They set standards for beauty, poetry, and taste. The way people wrote, dressed, and even bowed had roots in Kyoto's courtly traditions. They were the keepers of refinement in a world growing louder and rougher. Without them, the grace of classical Japan might have disappeared entirely under the clang of armor and the chatter of merchants. And then there was the emperor himself, a living god, or at least that's what everyone said. In reality, the emperor lived like a gilded prisoner. Every move he made was controlled by the shogunate. His proclamations needed approval. His income was rationed. His palace was both a home and a cage. The Tokugawa rulers treated the emperor's divinity like a useful brand, a spiritual seal of legitimacy for their own regime. Still, within those palace walls, a quiet dignity endured. The emperor's presence, even muted, symbolized continuity, an unbroken line stretching back over 1,000 years. To the common people, that mattered. Even if he had no soldiers or land, he represented something deeper: Japan itself. The samurai ruled, but the emperor was. And that subtle difference would one day shake the entire system to its core. Life in the court moved at a dreamlike pace. While Edo bustled with commerce, Kyoto lived in perpetual twilight, slow, deliberate, ceremonial. The sound of a brush gliding over paper could fill a room. The flicker of lanterns on painted screens could become a night's entertainment. Time here wasn't measured in hours, but in verses. But let's not romanticize too much. Beneath the layers of silk and etiquette, jealousy and intrigue thrived. Positions were limited, prestige even more so. Courtiers schemed for titles that came with no real authority, but immense symbolic value. Families plotted marriages to maintain rank, and gossip, delivered in whispers behind fans, was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Women in the court faced a peculiar fate. On one hand, they were central to its beauty. The muses, poets, dancers, and caretakers of taste. On the other, they were trapped by rigid gender codes. A court lady's value lay in her refinement, her ability to compose a haiku about dew, play the koto with grace, and walk without making a sound. But love, desire, choice? Those were luxuries most never tasted. Many were sent to the palace as children, raised and gilded isolation, and rarely saw the outside world again. And yet, some found ways to assert subtle power, through poetry, through letters, through wit. The language of court life was so coded that a single phrase could hold layers of rebellion. A poem about autumn leaves could secretly mock a rival. A line about a fading moon could hint at scandal. Power in Kyoto wasn't shouted, it was written between the lines. Still, as centuries passed, their world grew increasingly irrelevant. The real Japan now moved to Edo's rhythm, urban, restless, pragmatic. The emperor's court was a painting left too long in the sun, still beautiful, but fading at the edges. No one outside Kyoto cared much about who wore which color of robe or recited which poem. The rest of the nation was chasing profit, power, and survival. But even in their decline, the aristocrats preserved something invaluable, a memory of Japan's ancient identity. When the storm of modernization finally came and the shogunate crumbled, it would be the emperor and his forgotten court who rose again from the ashes to lead a new nation. The irony? The same figurehead everyone ignored would become the face of Japan's rebirth. For now, though, Kyoto sleeps in perfumed silence, its courtiers wrapped in rituals, while the world outside rumbles with change. And that change is coming fast. From the farmers who toil in the mud to the monks who pray for balance. Because if the samurai and nobles lived by the sword and the brush, the monks lived by something older still, the invisible power of belief. Before the clang of swords and the shuffle of merchants, before the ink of bureaucracy or the whisper of poetry, Japan's heartbeat belonged to the temples. Faith wasn't a matter of choice. It was the air you breathed, the water you bathed in, the rice you ate. Buddhism and Shinto weren't abstract ideas tucked away in scripture. They were living presences, shaping everything from how you built your house to how you washed your hands. In a world ruled by status and order, the monks and priests were the ones who ruled the invisible. Walk into a temple on any given morning and you'd see it. Barefoot monks sweeping stone courtyards, their robes rustling like whispers, incense rising in spirals thick enough to taste. Bells chimed, echoing through valleys, calling not just the faithful, but the uncertain, the weary, the desperate. In feudal Japan, religion wasn't just about salvation, it was about balance. The fields needed blessings. The dead needed prayers. The shogun needed legitimacy. The peasants needed hope. Buddhism had been imported centuries earlier from China and Korea, but by the Edo period, it was as Japanese as the cherry blossom. Yet it didn't stand alone. Shinto, the native faith of kami and spirits, intertwined with it like ivy around stone. One provided structure and philosophy, the other heart and belonging. Together they built a system that touched every soul, from the emperor to the Ita. And yes, the system was practical. When the Tokugawa shogunate rose to power, it needed control, not just of land, but of minds. Religion became its quiet ally. Every family had to register with a local Buddhist temple. Ostensibly, this was to curb the spread of Christianity, a dangerous new import the shogunate despised. But in reality, it created one of the earliest forms of population tracking. Temples became bureaucratic hubs, keeping records, issuing certificates, verifying births and deaths. Faith became paperwork, and through that paperwork, the state extended its reach into every household. But beyond the politics, the temples were sanctuaries of both solace and hypocrisy. Many monks lived austere lives of meditation, discipline, and charity. They cultivated gardens that mirrored cosmic order, wrote poems about impermanence, and sought enlightenment through simplicity. Others, though, indulged in the very vices they preached against: drinking, gambling, even keeping mistresses. The line between piety and pleasure blurred easily when you were respected, untouchable, and tax-exempt. Still, for the average person, temples were lifelines. They marked the rhythm of existence: birth, marriage, death. You'd visit shrines to pray for good harvests, for children, for love, for rain. You'd hang wooden plaques with wishes scrolled in trembling handwriting. The gods of Shinto, Kami, were everywhere. In mountains, rivers, storms, even kitchen fires. You didn't need theology to believe in them. You just needed to open your eyes. And oh, how people believed! They wore talismans to ward off illness, recited sutras to calm angry spirits, and blamed everything from droughts to toothaches on cosmic imbalance. Superstition wasn't ignorance, it was survival. In a world where medicine was crude and nature was merciless, you needed to feel that someone or something was listening. But religion was also a mirror of social hierarchy. Not all souls were equal before the gods. The same purity codes that defined class shaped faith. A samurai's funeral was a grand ceremony with chanting and incense. An Edda's body might be burned quietly at the edge of town. Certain temples refused offerings from unclean hands. The idea of karmic punishment became a convenient way to justify social inequality. If you were born poor or sick, it must be because of past life sins. Divine order became an excuse for human cruelty. And yet, faith also carried the seeds of rebellion. Buddhist sects like the Jodo Shinshu, True Pure Land, offered salvation not through strict ritual, but through sincere faith, a radical idea that appealed to commoners. Some temples became centers of resistance during earlier centuries, their monks wielding spears as well as sutras. The shogunate remembered those uprisings and made sure to keep the temples close, but never too powerful again. Monasteries also served as schools. Literacy was rare, but monks could read, write, and teach. Many peasants sent their sons, sometimes even daughters, to temple schools to learn basic characters, proverbs, and morals. Ironically, in a society obsessed with keeping people in their place, religion became one of the few paths that offered a glimpse of intellectual freedom. And then there were the pilgrimages. Every year, thousands of believers, farmers, merchants, beggars, traveled across mountains to visit sacred sites like Kiyomizu-dera or Ise Grand Shrine. It was faith, yes, but also escape, a brief, sanctioned break from duty. On the road, class blurred. A samurai and a peasant might share a meal. A monk might trade jokes with a merchant. For a few days, everyone was just a soul seeking grace under the same sky. Religion also gave Japan some of its greatest art. Temple architecture, the curvature of roofs, the tranquil ponds reflecting sky and cedar, all expressions of harmony between man and nature. Even the act of arranging stones or raking sand became spiritual. Every petal that fell in a temple garden whispered a lesson. Beauty was fleeting. Life was impermanent, and peace came only through acceptance. Still, the temple bells couldn't drown out the growing hum of change. By the late Edo period, Japan was restless. Foreign ships loomed on the horizon. Merchants quietly challenged the samurai, and people began to question whether divine order really justified their suffering. Monks debated the meaning of enlightenment in a society where enlightenment didn't feed the hungry. Faith, once an anchor, began to feel like a weight. But belief doesn't vanish. It evolves. And as Japan's feudal structure neared its breaking point, those who prayed began to dream of something more tangible: freedom, equality, and renewal. The gods had watched silently for centuries. Soon, their worshippers would demand action. The rice paddies of feudal Japan were oceans of labor, shimmering green in spring, golden in autumn, and red with calloused hands all year round. This was the world of the peasants, the invisible engines of an empire built on sweat, mud, and taxes. For every samurai polishing his blade, 100 farmers bent their backs beneath the sun. For every courtier composing a haiku about moonlight, a dozen peasants trudged barefoot through knee-deep water, pulling weeds from the emperor's supper. Their lives were bound not by choice, but by rice. Rice was life. Rice was money. Rice was dex. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, rice wasn't just a crop. It was currency, social status, and control. The wealth of a domain was measured in koku, one koku being the amount of rice needed to feed one person for a year. Daimyo collected rice from peasants. Samurai received stipends in rice, and taxes were measured in rice. It was a perfect circle of dependency that left only one group truly hungry: the people who grew it. Peasants were legally tied to their villages, forbidden from traveling without permission. Leaving without a travel pass wasn't just risky, it was a crime. The shogunate wanted stability above all else, and mobility was the enemy of order. A village wasn't just home, it was a cage. Birth determined destiny, and destiny had muddy feet. A typical peasant's day began before dawn. The morning mist hung over the paddies like breath from sleeping giants. They worked in rhythm with the earth, plowing, planting, harvesting, repairing irrigation ditches, all by hand, all year long. There were no weekends, no holidays except the ones prescribed by temple festivals. Even those were less about rest and more about rituals that, conveniently, blessed the next planting season. And when the tax collectors came, there was no mercy. The village headman, often a farmer himself, trapped between loyalty to his people and obedience to the samurai, would kneel before the officials as they measured and recorded every grain. Peasants could be left with barely enough to survive the winter. Starvation wasn't rare, it was routine. Some hid rice in jars buried beneath their floors, or mixed sand with the tax grain to cheat the scales. If caught, punishment was swift and brutal. Flogging, confiscation, or worse. Yet for all the hardship, the village was a universe of quiet dignity and resilience. Peasants formed cooperatives to share tools, water, and labor. Families helped each other rebuild homes after floods or fires. Seasonal festivals like Oban or harvest celebrations transformed even the poorest hamlet into a burst of color and music, a brief rebellion against monotony. For one night, everyone danced, drank, and forgot how heavy life was. The irony? Many peasants were better educated than you might think. Through temple schools, Tatakoya, even farm children learned basic reading and arithmetic. They studied Confucian morals, loyalty, diligence, respect, which the shogunate conveniently promoted to keep everyone obedient. But literacy, once planted, grows roots of its own. Letters began to circulate, stories spread, and some farmers started writing their grievances. And those grievances were many. Floods, droughts, and crop failures could devastate entire villages. But the tax collectors never failed to arrive, no matter how empty the fields were. Some peasants snapped. Rebellions, small, localized, desperate, erupted throughout the Edo period. They were called hyakusho ikki, peasant uprisings. And though most were crushed swiftly, they carried a dangerous message. The silent majority could roar. Imagine hundreds of starving farmers, armed with bamboo poles and kitchen knives, storming the local granary, shouting, "Lower the taxes! Open the storehouses!" The shogunate might dismiss them as rabble, but behind the chaos was something terrifying. Awareness. These weren't mindless riots. They were political statements born from centuries of submission. Of course, rebellion had a cost. Punishment was public and theatrical. Village leaders were executed as examples. Families of rebels were shamed or exiled. Yet each uprising left an echo, a warning that even the lowest rung of society had limits. Culturally, the peasants were rich in ways the elite couldn't fathom. Folk songs, proverbs, and festivals preserved a wisdom older than any law. They spoke of endurance, humor, and survival, because what else could you do but laugh when life was mud and taxes? Even their tools had names, their fields nicknames. Their daily grind turned into verses passed down like secret heirlooms. And within this muddy hierarchy, women were the backbone of the backbone. Peasant wives worked alongside their husbands in the fields, cooked, raised children, wove cloth, and managed the household economy. They were rarely recorded in official documents, but their absence in history only underscores their omnipresence in life. If the men plowed the soil, the women kept the world spinning. Still, hope flickered, fragile but persistent. The rhythm of seasons offered a kind of spiritual endurance. Spring always came, even after the harshest winter. Children laughed in the paddies. Lovers met at night by the edge of the irrigation channels. In that endless repetition, peasants found meaning, a quiet defiance against the system that owned their bodies, but never quite their spirits. And beneath it all, something subtle was changing. Roads improved, markets expanded, and surplus rice sometimes reached cities where it could be traded for coin. Peasants who learned to navigate this new economy found small cracks in the wall of class. A few began to rise, discreetly, dangerously, toward a kind of prosperity once forbidden to them. That shift, from mud to market, would soon upend everything. For as Japan's rigid hierarchy began to wobble under its own weight, a new class was waiting in the wings, ready to seize opportunity from tradition's crumbling hands. The scent of lacquer and freshly cut wood filled the narrow alleys of Edo, where the hum of saws mixed with the chatter of merchants and the occasional bark of a street vendor. This was a different kind of battlefield, one where coin, wit, and reputation determined survival. Welcome to the world of the chonin, the townspeople of feudal Japan. If peasants were the backbone of the country, the chonin were its restless heart. Technically, they sat below the samurai in the rigid class system, commoners, mere providers of material goods. But in reality, they were the ones fueling Japan's growing cities, crafting its culture, and quietly reshaping its economy from beneath the sword's shadow. Edo, Osaka, Kyoto, these cities pulsed with energy. Merchants dealt in rice, silk, sake, and dreams, while artisans crafted everything from armor to delicate porcelain teacups. The city's narrow streets twisted like veins, carrying the lifeblood of commerce to every corner. Yet for all their importance, the chonin were seen by the ruling samurai class as morally suspicious. Why? Because they made money without swinging swords. In the Confucian order imported from China, merchants were considered the lowest of the low, people who profited from others' labor. Samurai, in contrast, were meant to embody purity and honor. But ideals don't fill stomachs, and by the 18th century the balance had begun to tilt. While samurai families struggled under stagnant stipends paid in rice, merchants were swimming in silver and copper. The irony was delicious. The inferior class was becoming the master of the economy. Samurai borrowed money from merchants, pawned their family heirlooms, and sometimes even worked in disguise to repay debts. Behind the paper walls of the merchant houses, silent revolutions were brewing, not with weapons, but with ledgers. A merchant's life was a delicate dance between humility and ambition. They couldn't flaunt their wealth. That would draw the wrath of the authorities, but subtle signs told all. Fine silk robes hidden under plain cotton, elaborate garden stones carefully placed for modest beauty, calligraphy scrolls that hinted at refined taste. The art of pretending not to be rich became its own kind of fashion. And oh, the entertainment! The urban chonin were patrons of pleasure. Theaters thrived, especially the kabuki houses, where actors strutted and shouted through stories of forbidden love, betrayal, and honor twisted by fate. Merchants, barred from political power, found escape in fantasy. The stage became their parliament. The Yoshiwara pleasure district gleamed at night like a lantern-lit dream, offering everything from conversation to illusion. Artists captured it all. Woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, immortalized courtesans, actors, and city life in vivid color. They were mass-produced, affordable, and irresistible. A new culture was emerging, one that celebrated impermanence, beauty, and indulgence. The samurai might rule by birthright, but the chonin ruled by taste. Even literature changed. Writers like Ihara Seikaku chronicled the rise of the merchant class with wit and empathy, blending realism with humor. He wrote of love, loss, and business with the same pen, because for the chonin, commerce was not just livelihood, it was art. Of course, not all townspeople were wealthy. For every silk merchant in Osaka's Dotonbori, there were dozens of poor artisans laboring in cramped workshops, apprentices sleeping beside their tools. The hierarchy within the city was its own miniature version of feudal Japan, wealth at the top, sweat at the bottom. But the city offered something the countryside never could: possibility. Here, skill and cleverness could lift a person's standing, if not officially, then socially. A master craftsman could gain fame for his lacquerware. A tea seller could become a trusted supplier to a daimyo household. A bookseller could shape ideas that spread faster than any edict. Even within restriction, ambition found loopholes. And then there was Osaka, the nation's kitchen. The city was Japan's economic heart, where rice from all over the country flowed into warehouses and was traded for coin. Merchants in Osaka weren't just middlemen. They were proto-capitalists managing large-scale finance long before Europe's industrial age. The shogunate might have disdained them, but it also relied on them to keep the system running. Hypocrisy? Absolutely. But profitable hypocrisy keeps empires alive. With prosperity came anxiety. The ruling class feared that wealth would corrupt morality, that indulgence would rot discipline. Sumptuary laws attempted to rein merchants in, restricting clothing fabrics, house sizes, even the color of obi sashes. But laws could not smother taste. Subtle rebellion became a civic art form. Wearing muted tones with perfect craftsmanship was a statement louder than gold. This quiet sophistication birthed Ikki, the aesthetic of refined simplicity and confident restraint. To be Ikki was to be effortlessly stylish, never gaudy, always in control. It was the Chonin's answer to samurai stoicism, a code of beauty instead of battle. As the 18th century progressed, Japan's cities glowed brighter, its streets busier, its people sharper. The merchant's coin had bought not just goods, but influence, and the artisan's brush had redrawn the map of culture. Power was shifting, silently, one transaction at a time. The samurai still held their swords, but the merchants, they held the purse strings and the future. By the middle of the Edo period, the delicate balance between the ruling samurai and the industrious chonin was beginning to show cracks. Outwardly, everything appeared serene. The castles stood tall, the roads were orderly, and the villagers dutifully sent their rice taxes. But beneath that calm, the current of change was accelerating, and like any tide, it was unstoppable. The samurai was supposed to be the pinnacle of Japanese society, disciplined, noble, bound by Bushido, the way of the warrior. Yet in a time of peace that stretched for more than 2 centuries, their swords grew dull while their debts grew sharper. Many had become bureaucrats, clerks, and minor officials managing paperwork instead of warfare. The proud warriors who once lived and died by the sword were now tallying rice shipments, balancing budgets, and begging their retainers for advances. It was a slow humiliation. The ideals of loyalty and honor couldn't buy food or pay rent. Some samurai sold their blades, or worse, palmed their armor. Others turned to teaching, opening small schools to earn coin by passing on lessons in reading, calligraphy, or Confucian ethics, the same moral code that told them to stay in their place. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Meanwhile, the merchants they scorned were quietly building empires. Entire trading houses, or za, emerged. Networks that handled rice, silk, sake, and paper, connecting every corner of Japan. Their influence seeped into politics through debt. Daimyo borrowed from them. Sometimes entire domains ran on merchant credit. Money was supposed to be beneath the warrior class, but when the rice harvest fell short or the shogun demanded another round of extravagant displays in Edo, It was merchants who kept the machine oiled. You can almost imagine the awkward meetings, a stoic samurai in formal robes bowing deeply before a merchant in plain kimono, negotiating a loan that would keep his clan from disgrace, both pretending the transaction wasn't what it was, a reversal of power. Culture reflected this tension. Kabuki plays began featuring clever merchants and lazy samurai, stories where wit triumphed over rank. In the pleasure quarters, courtesans favored witty clients over noble ones. The myth of unshakable hierarchy was eroding under laughter, gossip, and satire. The streets of Edo became the true stage where class was constantly performed and sometimes mocked. But the cracks weren't just social, they were economic. The Bakufu, the shogunate government, relied heavily on taxes paid in rice. Yet inflation and market shifts meant rice no longer had stable value. The entire financial system, designed for a static agrarian society, was buckling under the weight of a dynamic urban economy. Merchants had adapted, diversifying their trade and developing sophisticated accounting systems. The government, still clinging to old ideals, did not. Adding to the instability, natural disasters struck with merciless regularity. Fires ravaged Edo so often it earned the grim nickname the City of Fires. Floods, earthquakes, and famines struck provinces across the archipelago. Every crisis revealed how brittle the structure of authority had become. Peasants rebelled, merchants hoarded, samurai despaired. Yet somehow the system persisted, not because it was strong, but because everyone feared what might replace it. In this uneasy peace, art flourished as an escape. The floating world, ukiyo, became both a metaphor and a mirror. Painters and poets celebrated transient beauty. Cherry blossoms that fell too soon, snow that melted by noon, fleeting love affairs. The Chonin understood impermanence better than anyone. They lived it daily, balancing between indulgence and ruin. But even indulgence had politics. In tea houses and bookshops, quiet discussions stirred about reform, about the wastefulness of daimyo processions, about samurai arrogance. These weren't revolutions, just murmurs. Yet every idea starts as a whisper. The merchant class had learned something crucial. Knowledge was power, and information could travel faster than armies. Behind the screens of Edo's homes, maps and foreign texts began circulating, smuggled through Nagasaki, the only port open to limited trade with the Dutch. The shogunate's policy of isolation, sakoku, kept Japan sealed off from the world. But cracks in the wall were widening. Scholars studied Dutch medicine, astronomy, and technology in secret. It was called Rongaku, Dutch learning, and it planted dangerous seeds of curiosity. For the first time in centuries, some Japanese began to question whether their rigid order was natural or simply convenient. If the stars could be measured by Western instruments, if diseases could be treated with new methods, what else might be possible? The Chonin had unwittingly laid the groundwork for that intellectual rebellion. Their appetite for books, art, and novelty had created a marketplace of ideas. They didn't carry swords, but they carried change in coin purses and pamphlets in plays. And as the century waned, a new generation began to see that the shogun's grip, once absolute, was softening. The economy was evolving faster than politics, and when that happens, the old rules start to look absurd. You can't command trade routes with Bushido. You can't tax ambition. In the smoky air of Edo's night markets, with lanterns swaying and merchants whispering deals that defied official limits, Japan's future was already taking shape, not on the battlefield, but in the ledger book, the workshop, and the restless dreams of people who were never meant to lead, yet couldn't stop building a new world anyway. Edo's streets may have glimmered with the pulse of trade and laughter, but behind the glow lay a quiet restlessness. The samurai could feel it in the air, though they couldn't name it. The merchants could count it in their coins, though they dared not speak it aloud. It was the faint scent of transformation, the kind that makes empires uneasy. By the early 19th century, the Tokugawa system was like an ancient wooden bridge, elegant but creaking under its own age. The structure still held, but every gust of change made it sway. The economy was shifting from feudal rigidity toward something dangerously modern. Commerce had outpaced control. Markets linked distant regions into invisible webs of trade. Rice, once the measure of wealth, was now being exchanged for coins, and those coins, minted, smuggled, hoarded, began to rewrite social boundaries. For peasants, this change was double-edged. On one hand, local markets allowed them to sell surplus goods, buy tools, and gain small independence from their landlords. On the other, they were more vulnerable than ever to the volatility of prices and taxes. When rice prices soared, so did starvation. When they collapsed, so did entire villages. The system that had promised stability above all was now devouring its own children. Samurai stipends, fixed in rice value, became worthless compared to the new cash economy. Imagine once proud retainers pawning their armor to pay a sake bill or tutoring merchant sons to make ends meet. The humiliation was profound. Some samurai blamed moral decay. Others blamed the shogunate's mismanagement. A few began dreaming dangerously of reform or even rebellion. Meanwhile, the merchants and artisans, once treated as expendable, were becoming indispensable. Silk weavers, paper makers, and sake brewers formed guilds, creating networks that rivaled the influence of daimyo themselves. Urban life had matured into a complex ecosystem, part theater, part machine, where survival required adaptability, not ancestry. And adaptability became the era's secret currency. The clever prospered, the rigid perished. Edo's carpenters designed homes resistant to the city's constant fires. Fishermen in coastal towns learned to read the tides with uncanny precision. Even the courtesans of Yoshiwara reinvented themselves as poets and trendsetters, wielding cultural influence that stretched beyond the pleasure quarters. Everyone was hustling, innovating, rebranding. Feudalism was still the official order, but the spirit of capitalism was already whispering in the night. The government tried to push back. Shoguns issued reform edicts like leaky bandages. The Kyoho, Kansei, and Tenpo reforms, all promising to restore moral purity and economic order. They targeted extravagance, theater, and luxury goods, trying to force the people back into frugality. Merchants were scolded for ostentation, theaters were censored, and brothels were restricted. The result? A cultural explosion, because nothing inspires creativity quite like repression. The more the authorities tried to ban pleasure, the more inventive pleasure became. Kabuki theaters went underground, re-emerging with new forms of satire hidden beneath historical allegories. Woodblock prints turned subtle rebellion into art. Actors portrayed as historical heroes, lovers disguised as moral lessons. And, in a way, the government's heavy hand made the culture more daring. The floating world, born as escapism, had matured into quiet defiance. Still, the veneer of control couldn't hide the cracks. Natural disasters struck one after another, floods, earthquakes, and famines that exposed the government's ineptitude. The Tenpo famine of the 1830s devastated northern Japan, killing hundreds of thousands. The streets of Odo filled with beggars, while the shogunate's relief efforts faltered under corruption and inefficiency. People began to whisper the unthinkable. Perhaps divine favor had left the shogun. Among the disillusioned rose new voices, scholars, reformers, and radicals. Some turned to Confucian moralism, preaching a return to discipline and simplicity. Others embraced Western ideas through Rongaku, studying medicine, navigation, and weaponry brought by Dutch traders. For the first time, intellectual debate became dangerous. To question the world's order was to question the shogun himself. In remote domains like Satsuma and Choshu, young samurai started forming study groups that looked suspiciously like think tanks, discussing modernization, military reform, and national unity. They called for strength through knowledge, for independence through adaptation. They admired Western ships, not for their foreignness, but for their power. Japan, they argued, could no longer afford to sleep behind closed borders. And then, as if history itself had been listening, a dark silhouette appeared on the horizon. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with black-hulled steamships that belched smoke and thunder. To the Japanese, they looked like floating dragons, metal monsters that defied wind and tide. The message was clear: open your ports, or we will open them for you. The shogunate's composure shattered. The illusion of isolation, so carefully maintained for centuries, dissolved in a single moment of industrial smoke. Japan's leaders, once confident in the divine order, now stood blinking in the glare of a new world. Panic swept the country. Some saw the foreigners as demons, others as opportunities. Merchants smelled profit. Samurai smelled humiliation. Scholars smelled revolution. The old world, built on rice and ritual, was about to collide with one built on iron and steam. And in that collision between the ancient and the modern, the honorable and the pragmatic, Japan's identity would be broken, reforged, and reborn in ways no one yet dared to imagine. When the black ships appeared in Edo Bay, Japan's centuries-old stillness cracked like thin ice. For 200 years, the nation had lived in deliberate seclusion, proud, self-contained, convinced of its cultural supremacy. Now, with a few cannon blasts and a puff of coal smoke, that illusion was gone. The arrival of Commodore Perry in 1853 was more than a diplomatic visit. It was an existential shock. His fleet wasn't just a collection of ships. It was a statement of power, a demonstration of what the West had become while Japan slept. Steam engines roared where sails once ruled, guns thundered with precision, and steel hulls shrugged off waves that would have splintered wooden boats. The samurai, once the ultimate warriors, suddenly found their swords looking like antiques. Harry's demand was simple: open Japan's ports to American trade. But the unspoken message was chilling: refuse and face annihilation. The shogunate, caught off guard, stalled and negotiated, but there was no winning move. In 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed. It was polite, diplomatic, and humiliating. Japan's centuries of isolation ended not with a proud proclamation, but with the signature of fear. Word of the encounter spread like wildfire. Villagers who had never seen a foreigner now whispered about monsters that spat fire. Samurai debated whether the shogun had betrayed divine protection. Merchants, on the other hand, smelled opportunity. If trade was coming, so was money. Even fear has a market. But the true aftershock wasn't economic, it was ideological. The shogunate's weakness had been exposed for all to see. For generations, the Tokugawa had claimed legitimacy as the guarantors of peace and divine order. Yet, when faced with a real threat, they capitulated. The illusion of unshakable authority shattered. And when an old order loses its mystique, it doesn't fade quietly. It collapses dramatically. Across Japan, old loyalties began to fracture. Reform-minded samurai from domains like Satsuma, Joshu, and Dosa began to question everything. The shogunate, isolation, even the meaning of loyalty itself. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, they cried. A slogan both patriotic and hypocritical, since they also wanted Western weapons to do the expelling. The shogunate, desperate to modernize, started buying ships, guns, and cannons from the very nations that had humiliated it. Shipyards buzzed with activity. Samurai were retrained to handle rifles, and foreign advisors were invited to teach everything from engineering to etiquette. But it was too little, too late. Reform born from panic rarely saves a regime. Edo itself became a cauldron of tension. Scholars preached modernization. Traditionalists called them traitors. Peasants faced higher taxes to fund new projects they didn't understand. Merchants thrived on chaos, trading imported goods in underground markets. The class lines that had held Japan together for centuries were dissolving faster than anyone could control. In the midst of this turmoil, strange new sights appeared. Japanese men wearing Western-style coats, hair cropped short instead of tied in the samurai topknot. Ships powered by steam cut through the bay like floating factories. Newspapers printed foreign news, and telegraph lines snaked across the cities. The future had arrived, uninvited and unstoppable. But the transition wasn't smooth. Violence erupted in the shadows. Loyalists who supported the emperor assassinated officials accused of collaboration. The shogunate responded with purges and executions. Whole domains turned into miniature war zones, torn between ancient honor and modern necessity. One man's reform was another man's betrayal. To the old guard, adopting Western ways meant abandoning Japanese soul. To the young radicals, clinging to tradition meant national suicide. The streets of Kyoto ran red with the blood of both. And through it all, the emperor, long a symbolic figurehead, began to stir. His court, once powerless, now became a magnet for rebels and reformers who saw him as the legitimate center of a new Japan. The shogun's shadow was fading, replaced by an idea older and more potent, the divine right of the emperor himself. By the late 1860s, the tension snapped. Samurai armies marched not for their lords, but for ideology. Domains that once competed for favor with the shogunate now joined forces to overthrow it. The Boshin War erupted, a civil war dressed in the language of restoration. The Tokugawa fought to preserve order. The reformers fought to rebuild it. Cannons thundered, rifles cracked, and banners of the rising sun fluttered over fields soaked in the blood of both past and future. It was not merely a battle for power. It was a battle for identity. Was Japan to remain a feudal relic or emerge as a modern nation? When the smoke cleared in 1869, the answer was written in ash. The Tokugawa shogunate was gone. The emperor, once caged in ceremony, stood at the dawn of a new era, the Meiji Restoration. The old social ladder, which had once seemed eternal, now lay splintered. Peasants, samurai, and merchants alike stared into the uncertain light of modernity. The swords that once symbolized pride and purpose were being melted down into railways and factories, and as Japan raced toward industrialization, those born into rigid roles would soon face a new challenge. Not escaping their station, but surviving a world where status meant nothing and progress demanded everything. The dawn of the Meiji era did not feel like triumph. It felt like disorientation. Imagine waking up after an earthquake. The house still stands, but every wall has shifted. That was Japan in the 1870s. The Tokugawa order, with all its hierarchies and certainties, had crumbled overnight. In its place stood a vision both exhilarating and terrifying. A modern nation that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the West or be crushed by it. The new Meiji government moved fast, too fast for many to comprehend. Edicts flew out of Tokyo like thunderbolts. Samurai privileges abolished. The rigid class system dissolved. Topknots, the proud symbol of warrior status, banned. The daimyo were stripped of their fiefs and converted into governors of prefectures under imperial authority. It was as if someone had taken a brush and wiped away 2 centuries of ink with a single stroke. For the peasants, it was liberation on paper and confusion in practice. Technically, they were now citizens, free to own land and move where they pleased. But the government still needed taxes, and land reform came with a cruel twist. The new monetary tax system demanded cash, not rice. Farmers who had never touched a coin in their lives now had to sell part of their harvest just to pay the government. When crop yields fell or prices dropped, debt swallowed them whole. The samurai fared no better. Overnight, they lost their stipends, their titles, their right to carry swords, the very things that defined their existence. Many tried to adapt, becoming bureaucrats, teachers, or businessmen, but not all could make the leap from warrior to office clerk. Some clung to their swords in defiance, others sold them to survive. There were even stories of former samurai wandering the streets, offering sword lessons to curious Westerners for a few coins. It wasn't just an economic upheaval. It was a psychological one. The world no longer had a place for the ideals that had once defined manhood, loyalty, and honor. The code of Bushido, once the beating heart of the samurai class, suddenly felt like a ghost, noble but irrelevant. Meanwhile, Japan's modernization machine roared forward. The government sent students abroad to study science and industry, imported foreign experts to build railroads and shipyards, and rewrote the legal code to mimic those of Europe. Telegraph wires stretched across the islands, and locomotives screamed where ox carts once creaked. The streets of Tokyo, no longer Edo, buzzed with a strange new rhythm. Men in Western suits and bowler hats rushed past shrines still perfumed with incense. Gas lamps flickered beside paper lanterns. Newspapers, a novelty just years before, now debated everything from parliamentary reform to women's education. The city was learning to speak two languages, one of tradition, one of progress. But beneath this glittering surface, resentment brewed. Many samurai saw the reforms as an insult to everything Japan stood for. How could a man serve his country without his sword? How could loyalty exist when hierarchy was gone? The emperor, once their sacred cause, now seemed distant, surrounded by bureaucrats who spoke of budgets and factories instead of virtue and valor. The breaking point came in 1877. In the southern domain of Satsuma, the same region that had helped overthrow the shogunate, a rebellion erupted under the leadership of Saigo Takamori, a man of immense honor and charisma. Saigo embodied the old ideal of the samurai, humble, brave, loyal to death. He had once fought for the emperor. Now he fought against the government that claimed to serve him. The Satsuma Rebellion was both tragic and inevitable. Tens of thousands of former samurai rallied to Saigo's banner, armed with swords and rifles, marching under the rising sun as if to reclaim Japan's soul. Against them stood the imperial army, modern, conscripted, equipped with Western weapons and drilled in European tactics. The battles were brutal and heartbreakingly symbolic. Muskets against katanas, steam trains ferrying soldiers to face men on horseback. It was the past dueling the future, and everyone knew which side would win. By the time Saigo's forces were cornered near Kagoshima, Japan's transformation was complete in spirit as well as form. The samurai, once the guardians of the nation, had become its rebels. Saigo's final charge, wounded and bleeding, was as much ritual as rebellion. When he fell, many called him Japan's last true samurai. After the rebellion's suppression, the Meiji government moved swiftly to erase any remnants of the old feudal order. Sword-wearing was banned entirely. Samurai registries were dissolved. The word samurai itself faded from official documents, replaced by shizoku, a polite bureaucratic euphemism for former people of status. And yet, in erasing the samurai, Japan did not truly kill their spirit. Bushido, that ancient code of honor, loyalty, and sacrifice, began to take on a new form. No longer tied to a class, it became an idea, one that could guide soldiers, students, and even businessmen. The irony was delicious. In destroying the samurai, modern Japan preserved their essence, recasting it as the moral backbone of a nation hurtling into industrial modernity. But for those who lived through the transition, it was less poetry and more pain. Entire generations were forced to redefine what it meant to serve, to belong, to have purpose. And for the countless commoners who had once dreamed of escaping their station, freedom proved to be its own kind of burden. They had been promised equality, but what they got was competition. Freedom, as it turned out, wasn't a gift, it was a test. The Meiji Restoration had torn away the chains of feudalism, but it hadn't handed anyone a manual on how to live without them. Former peasants, now called farmers, were told they were free to prosper if they could survive the market. Former samurai, renamed shizoku, were told they could reinvent themselves if they could bear the humiliation of laboring alongside the people they once ruled. Villages that had once been governed by ancestral custom now found themselves tangled in bureaucracy. Taxes, once paid in rice, had to be delivered in yen. Bureaucrats came with ledgers, not swords, and the consequences of failure were the same as ever: eviction, poverty, starvation. The illusion of choice was a cruel new invention. You could move, work, buy, sell, but only if you had the means to do so. For many, modernization meant little more than debt wrapped in Western words. And yet, despite all this chaos, Japan was changing in ways that no one could have imagined. Railroads stitched the islands together, shrinking distances that had defined isolation for centuries. The telegraph carried news faster than gossip could spread. Steamships replaced fishing boats. Factories sprouted like mushrooms, belching smoke into the same skies once filled with prayer incense. Cities exploded with movement and noise. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, these were no longer provincial outposts of a warrior aristocracy, but sprawling urban jungles of workers, students, merchants, and dreamers. The rhythms of the land, planting, harvesting, resting, gave way to the ticking of clocks, the shriek of factory whistles. Time itself became an industrial resource, no longer governed by the seasons, but by the demands of production. For the first time in Japanese history, a farmer's son could theoretically become a soldier, a clerk, or even a politician. The government's conscription law, passed in 1873, made military service mandatory for all men regardless of class. It was sold as equality, every man defending his emperor, but in practice it was another form of discipline. Young men from rice fields and fishing villages now marched under banners of national unity, drilled by officers who preached loyalty not to a lord, but to the emperor himself. The transformation was astonishing. In a few short decades, Japan had evolved from a feudal patchwork of isolated domains into a centralized industrial state with ambitions that stretched far beyond its shores. But this came at a price. The human cost of modernization was steep. Families broken apart, traditions uprooted, identities lost in the blur of progress. Women, especially, felt the dissonance between new ideals and old expectations. The Meiji government promoted education for girls, but only to make them better wives and mothers, loyal supporters of the household and the nation. A new phrase entered the lexicon: good wife, wise mother. It sounded noble enough, but beneath it lay the same old logic, control dressed in civility. Still, cracks were forming in that old logic. In urban centers, young women began working in textile mills, the backbone of Japan's growing industrial economy. They left their villages, sent wages home, and endured grueling hours in sweltering, dangerous factories. Some called them the flowers of the nation, But their reality was far from romantic. They were exploited, underpaid, and often discarded when ill or injured. Yet they represented something radical: mobility. They were no longer confined to the rice fields or the household. They were workers, visible, indispensable, and slowly, inevitably aware. Meanwhile, intellectuals and reformers debated what it meant to be Japanese in a world ruled by Western powers. Newspapers published essays demanding women's rights, education for all, and social justice, ideas that would have been treasonous a generation earlier. The government, nervous but shrewd, encouraged a version of nationalism that combined modern science with ancient loyalty. You could study chemistry or physics as long as you still bowed to the emperor. The people adapted with astonishing resilience. Former samurai taught in schools, their swords traded for chalk. Peasants became soldiers, their sweat transformed into national pride. Merchants became industrialists, their sons educated in Western universities. The old boundaries blurred, and though inequality persisted, the lines were no longer absolute. But beneath the enthusiasm for progress, something else simmered: a collective anxiety that Japan's identity was slipping away. Western clothes, Western manners, Western philosophies, they flooded the nation like a tidal wave. For every new invention imported, a custom was lost. The tea ceremony gave way to coffee houses. Kimonos were replaced with suits. English phrases crept into daily speech. It was exhilarating, but also unnerving. What did it mean to be Japanese when even the shape of your hat was imported? When loyalty, once the cornerstone of feudal life, was now demanded by a faceless state instead of a living lord? When honor, once tied to sword and duty, became measured by salary and position, the Meiji elite believed they could balance it all. That Japan could borrow the machines of the West without surrendering its soul. But for the people who lived through it, the balance was far from clear. Modernity was not just a march forward. It was a constant negotiation with ghosts. And as Japan's factories glowed through the night, the shadows of its feudal past still lingered, watching, whispering, waiting to be remembered. By the dawn of the 20th century, Japan had done the unthinkable. In the span of just a few generations, it had gone from a feudal archipelago of rice fields and sword duels to a modern industrial power with telegraphs, trains, and a standing army. The rest of the world, especially the West, watched in disbelief. They'd written Japan off as another backward Eastern kingdom, but now this once isolated nation was demanding a seat at the table of empires. But beneath the surface of this rapid rise, the ghosts of the Tokugawa order still stirred. You could change the government, modernize the military, rewrite the Constitution, but changing the mindset of millions was another matter entirely. Deep down, Japan was still haunted by the invisible hierarchies that had shaped it for centuries. People still measured themselves not by ability, but by origin. A factory worker might bow to his manager as if to a lord. A clerk might treat his superior with the reverence once reserved for samurai. The words had changed: boss instead of daimyo, employee instead of vassal, but the structure was eerily familiar. The new society, with its glittering cities and steel machines, didn't erase the old one. It simply gave it a new vocabulary. The code of Bushido, once a private creed of the warrior class, was resurrected and nationalized, reinvented as a moral compass for every citizen. Loyalty to the emperor replaced loyalty to the Lord. Discipline in the workplace replaced devotion on the battlefield. The spirit of the samurai was now preached in schools, printed in textbooks, and drilled into soldiers. It was Japan's way of fusing its past and future, a feudal soul in an industrial body. Education became the new battlefield of identity. Schools taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also obedience and sacrifice. Every morning began with a bow to the portrait of the emperor. Children memorized patriotic songs about the divine origins of Japan, about duty and destiny. The message was clear. Freedom was not individual, it was national. You existed not for yourself, but for Japan. For many, it worked. The same communal loyalty that once tied peasants to lords now tied citizens to their country. The result was a collective strength that astonished the world. When Japan went to war with China in 1894 and Russia in 1904, it did so with the unity and fervor of a people who believed they were avenging centuries of humiliation. Victories in those wars didn't just expand territory, they validated the entire modernization project. Japan, once an isolated kingdom of farmers and swordsmen, had defeated giants. Yet every triumph came with a cost. Industrial progress created vast inequalities. The new zaibatsu, family-run corporate empires like Mitsubishi and Sumitomo, amassed fortunes that rivaled the old daimyo domains. Workers toiled in grim factories under slogans about national pride, while the wealthy dined on imported wines in Tokyo's Western-style districts. The rigid social pyramid had returned, only now it wore a business suit instead of armor. In the countryside, modernization meant something else entirely. The railways and markets that connected Japan's cities bypassed many rural villages. leaving farmers at the mercy of urban demand. When rice prices fell, suicides spiked. Young men fled to cities in search of work, while their families struggled to maintain ancestral plots. The government's slogans about progress meant little to a farmer watching his children go hungry. And yet, Japan's leaders pushed harder. Western powers had carved Asia into colonies, and Japan was determined not to be anyone's next victim. The Meiji vision evolved into something more ambitious and more dangerous. If Japan wanted equality with the West, it had to play by imperial rules. It had to become an empire itself. The seeds of that ambition were planted early. Victories in war bred confidence, and confidence bred appetite. Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, each became a stepping stone in Japan's march toward regional dominance. The government preached civilization and enlightenment, but what it really meant was power. Japan was no longer the humble island kingdom watching from afar. It was now a rising force with steel ships, cannons, and a burning desire to prove itself. But while the banners of empire fluttered in the wind, the ordinary people beneath them were still climbing the same old ladder, invisible, exhausting, and unforgiving. A farmer's son might wear a uniform, but his family still bowed to landlords. A factory girl might earn a wage, but her future was still bound by marriage or exhaustion. The forms had changed, the symbols had evolved, but the structure, that relentless hierarchy born in the rice fields of feudal Japan, persisted like a shadow that refused to fade. Even the emperor, that living symbol of national unity, was trapped in the myth his government had built around him. He was both divine and powerless, worshipped yet carefully controlled. The people saw him as the embodiment of destiny. The politicians saw him as a useful illusion. The entire modern order rested on a paradox. Japan had raced into the future by chaining itself to the ghosts of its past. And that paradox would define everything to come. Because when a society builds its identity on discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice, when the weight of centuries never truly lifts, those virtues can become weapons. And soon Japan would find itself standing at the edge of another transformation, one far more explosive than any before. The early decades of the 20th century were a fever dream for Japan, a whirlwind of pride, power, and peril. The Meiji miracle had matured into the machinery of empire. Tokyo gleamed with electric lights. Railways threaded the islands like veins of steel, and the country's navy bristled with the latest warships. To the outside world, Japan looked unstoppable, the first Asian power to stand shoulder to shoulder with Europe. But if you peeled back the layers of progress, The same social DNA still pulsed beneath: hierarchy, obedience, and duty, reborn in uniform. Schools no longer just taught patriotism, they manufactured it. Children recited oaths to the emperor, swore to die for the nation, and sang songs about glorious sacrifice. Every map in every classroom painted Japan at the center of the world, its empire spreading like sunlight across Asia. The old feudal virtue of togi, loyalty, was repackaged into national policy. The bushido that once bound samurai to their lords now bound citizens to the state. It was feudalism without the fiefs, loyalty without limit. And it worked frighteningly well. By the 1930s, Japan had transformed itself into a disciplined, militarized society. Factories didn't just make goods, they made soldiers. The workplace became the new battlefield. The boss, a general; the worker, a foot soldier of progress. People no longer asked if they should obey. They asked how fast. The old rice fields had given birth to a modern war machine. But this rise carried a dark undercurrent. Beneath the rhetoric of unity and destiny, inequality still ruled daily life. Industrial workers labored 12-hour shifts for pennies. Farmers, still crushed by debt, sold daughters to textile mills or brothels. The same rigid ladder that had once dictated who could wear silk or carry swords now decided who could eat 3 meals a day. For every man in uniform parading through Tokyo, there were 10 villagers back home counting rice grains to survive. The emperor, Hirohito, became both a god and a mirror, reflecting back the devotion of a people who had been trained for centuries to serve. The Meiji Constitution gave him supreme authority in theory, but in practice, the generals and bureaucrats pulled the strings. It was Tokugawa politics in Western dress, absolute power wrapped in ceremony. The names had changed, but the logic was ancient. Everyone served someone, and no one dared ask why. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, few questioned it. Expansion was presented not as conquest, but as destiny, the natural extension of the nation's will. Newspapers called it liberation. The army called it duty. The people called it pride. After all, hadn't Japan spent centuries proving its strength, clawing its way from isolation to empire? Now it was time to show the world and itself that it could rule as well as the West ever had. But pride has a way of blinding even the sharpest swords. The wars that followed, in China, across the Pacific, devoured the very generation raised on loyalty and sacrifice. The factories that had promised prosperity became engines of destruction. Sons were conscripted, fathers sent to die, mothers taught to smile through hunger. Patriotism turned into a form of hunger itself, insatiable, consuming, never satisfied. At home, life was a strange mix of modern efficiency and medieval obedience. Citizens lined up for ration cards, with the same patience their ancestors once showed while kneeling before their lords. Propaganda films played in movie houses, preaching that death in battle was not tragedy, but fulfillment. The samurai's devotion had been nationalized, his sword replaced by a rifle. It was no longer the shogun who demanded your loyalty. It was the nation itself. Even after the bombs fell, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki scorched the illusion of invincibility, that deep-seated hierarchy did not disappear. It only shifted again. The post-war years brought a new constitution, democracy, and peace, but the old habits of deference and conformity lingered like smoke. The emperor renounced his divinity, yet people still bowed when his name was spoken. Corporations replaced clans. The salaryman replaced the samurai. The battlefield became the office, and every briefcase carried the invisible weight of generations. You see, the ladder never really vanished. It just changed shape. In factories, the senior worker commanded respect like a local lord. In schools, students learned not to question, but to endure. In homes, fathers held authority like miniature daimyo, their word law beneath the roof. Japan had mastered the art of modernization without ever fully shedding its feudal reflexes. The Tokugawa shogunate had died, but its spirit had simply moved into new walls. It's tempting to call it resilience, and in many ways it was. This ability to absorb change without losing identity is what let Japan rebuild after total ruin. But it was also a double-edged sword. That same instinct to endure, obey, and sacrifice, the very traits that had once allowed a rice farmer to survive under a samurai's shadow, could also keep him from standing upright when the world demanded rebellion. By the mid-20th century, Japan was standing again, taller, richer, prouder. But its posture was still shaped by centuries of bowing. The social ladder had stretched to skyscraper heights, yet everyone still knew exactly where they stood on it. The peasants had become workers. The samurai had become managers, and the emperor had become a symbol. And somewhere, deep within that unbroken chain of obedience and endurance, the echoes of feudal Japan still murmured, quiet but unmistakable. When the dust of war settled and Japan lay in ruins, something extraordinary happened. Out of the ashes of empire and defeat rose a nation determined not only to rebuild, but to redefine itself. The occupation forces brought democracy, freedom of speech, and a constitution that renounced war forever. But what the Americans saw as transformation, the Japanese experienced as something subtler, another mutation in a long history of adaptation. The faces of authority had changed, the slogans had changed, but the deep rhythms of endurance, hierarchy, and duty still beat in the background. Factories replaced fortresses. Instead of soldiers, Japan trained engineers, accountants, and assembly line workers. The new battlefield was economic, not military, and the goal was not conquest, but efficiency. The country that once worshipped the sword now worshipped the stopwatch. In place of the samurai's katana gleamed the worker's pen, the manager's stamp, the engineer's slide rule. Each carried the same weight of expectation, precision, loyalty, sacrifice for the greater good. The miracle of the post-war era was staggering. In a few decades, Japan went from starvation to superpower. Cars, televisions, and electronics poured from its factories into every corner of the globe. Westerners who once feared Japanese soldiers now marveled at Japanese technology. And behind every success story was that same old discipline, the unspoken contract between individual and collective. A worker might labor 14 hours a day, but he did it with pride. A company might own his time, his health, even his evenings, but it also gave him identity. The corporate logo became the new family crest. The morning bow to the supervisor replaced the bow to the Lord. It wasn't all harmony, of course. Beneath the polished efficiency of the economic miracle, the old ghosts of the social ladder still whispered. Seniority mattered more than innovation. Women, despite entering the workforce, often found themselves confined to clerical roles or forced out after marriage. The salaryman's loyalty was rewarded, but his exhaustion was invisible. Until it wasn't. The phenomenon of karoshi, death from overwork, was the modern echo of dying for one's lord. The battlefield had moved indoors, but the casualties were just as real. And yet, even amid the contradictions, Japan's post-war identity carried something profoundly human, a quiet refusal to collapse. The same endurance that had once chained peasants through rice fields now powered an entire nation through reconstruction, recession, and reinvention. The feudal spirit had not died. It had been repurposed. Honor was no longer measured by swordsmanship, but by dedication. Duty was no longer fealty to a lord, but responsibility to one's craft, one's team, one's country. By the 1980s, Japan had become a symbol of modern success. Neon cities pulsing with life, bullet trains slicing through mountains, an economy that seemed to run on precision alone. But the paradox remained. Beneath all the glittering innovation was an ancient reflex: to endure quietly, to obey structure, to seek harmony above all. Even rebellion had a certain politeness to it. And that, perhaps, was Japan's greatest strength, and its oldest chain. The 21st century has only deepened that paradox. The rigid hierarchies of feudal Japan have softened, but not vanished. The young challenge authority more freely now. Women carve independent paths. Technology blurs boundaries of class and geography. Yet the collective instinct, the desire to belong, to fulfill one's place, still shapes every interaction, from the bow of a cashier to the apology of a CEO. You can see centuries of etiquette compressed into a single gesture. When you walk the streets of Tokyo today, past the neon towers, the vending machines, the shrines tucked between skyscrapers, you're seeing all of Japan's history layered in one moment. The rice farmer's humility, the samurai's precision, the merchant's pragmatism, the salaryman's loyalty, all coexist in a single glance, a bow, a heartbeat. Feudalism didn't vanish, it evolved, threading its logic through the veins of modern life like silk through steel. And that's the story, isn't it? Assigned at birth, Japan's people once lived and died within an inescapable ladder. Peasants, samurai, lords, untouchables. That ladder was supposed to have fallen centuries ago, but in truth it never fell. It transformed. From the rigid hierarchy of the shogunate to the invisible hierarchy of the modern world. Yet within that transformation lies something remarkable: survival with dignity. Across centuries of upheaval, invasion, modernization, and reinvention, Japan never lost its sense of self. It learned how to bend without breaking, how to obey without surrendering the soul, how to modernize without erasing memory. So, when we look at Japan today, efficient, polite, endlessly complex, we're not seeing a contradiction. We're seeing the culmination of 1,000 years of adaptation. The feudal code lives on not in swords or castles, but in the quiet persistence of everyday life. In every bowed head, every whispered apology, every perfectionist stroke of a craftsman's brush, there echoes a truth forged in centuries past. You can change the empire, the emperor, even the entire world, but the spirit that endures within the people, that's something no social ladder can contain.